Hello friends, welcome to our YouTube channel. My name is Gopi. I am a cybersecurity architect and penetration tester. Today we are discussing about the threat modeling execution for a sample web application. By following the manual approach, how we need to execute the threat model, that aspect we can see it today. Before going to the threat modeling actual execution, we will see some basic abbreviation and definitions which is relevant to the threat modeling. Then we can deep dive the threat model and we can discuss about the sample web application threat model report. Okay, let's go to our session now. Okay, abbreviation OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, STRIDE, Spoofing, Tampering, Reputation, Information Disclosure, Denial of Service, Elevation of Privileges, CVE, Common Vulnerability and Exposure, NVD, National Vulnerability Database, SOUP, Software of Unknown Provenance, 3PP, third party publishing software. Okay, terminologies and definition which is related to threat model, asset, hardware, software, process, business logic, data flow, workflow in the system or application which needs to be protected from the cyber threat is called asset. Threat, possible way of attack surface to exploit the vulnerability to damage the system functionality or to make the system reputation. Vulnerability, weakness or loopholes of the system is called vulnerability. External dependency, target application connecting with the external component or external ecosystems. Threat entry point, entry point or entry gates for the attackers to exploit the vulnerability in the application. Threat agent, different types of threat agent who is executing the vulnerability intentionally or unintentionally is called threat agent. Okay, contents, when we create the threat model of the any application or system, at least these contents we need to follow. First, introduction, purpose, the purpose of the threat model, scope of the threat model assessment, not in scope of the threat model assessment, reference document, example, the HLD, high level design document, data flow diagrams, DFTs are reference document whenever we create the threat model. Input for the threat model. When we create the threat model, we need to refer multiple threat modeling methodologies and standards. Accordingly, we need to execute the threat model. Example, the Microsoft threat model, ARM practices, NIST threat modeling practices, OWASP threat modeling practices. At least these practices we need to consider when we create the threat model. Threat modeling approaches. When we are executing the threat model, at least these steps we need to follow. First, we need to identify the asset identification in the application or system, personal data identification and classification, cybersecurity bill of materials and third-party components, application, architecture and DFTs, decompose the application architecture, external dependency of the application, threat entry points for the application, threat agents for the application. These steps we need to consider whenever we execute the threat model. So based on this input, we need to determine threat and security controls for the target application. When we create the threat model, the STRIDE descriptions we need to understand. Based on the industry practices, the threat we need to identify and we need to categorize with the STRIDE methodology. And required security controls we need to identify to mitigate identified threats in the application. Also, the general threat modeling aspect, what standards and practices we have, these aspects we can discuss today. Okay, introduction of the threat modeling report. We are assuming this is a basic web application. and we are executing the threat model for the web application, and this is the sample report. So first purpose of the report, we are clear. We need to execute the threat model and identify all possible security threats for the sample web application. Scope of the threat model component, like web client, authentication, authorization, session management, input validation, server configuration, server to database communication, data storage, data in transit, configuration files, logs, web application hardening gaps, web application third party components vulnerabilities, if we have any vulnerabilities on the component. These are all the components we are considering as scope. And not in scope, whenever we create the threat model, the not in scope details also, if possible, we can create. Example, the infrastructure components are not considered in this sample report, so infrastructure components are not in scope. Okay, reference document. The reference document is, one is a high level design document, data flow diagrams. So these are all the common reference document when we create the threat model. Threat modeling input. When we create the threat model, any of the application or system, we need to consider these inputs to execute the threat model. Example, the HLD data flow diagrams are basic prerequisite. So in addition that, the system and software specification, security requirements, application asset list, cyber security bill of materials, then the threat information from Microsoft, NIST, CVE, possible threats of end-to-end application, the industry standard practices also one of the input. Then the architecture design, then the architecture, data flow, workflows, deployment and configuration. These also as one of the input to execute the threat model. At least these inputs we need to gather before creating the threat model. Okay, threat modeling execution approaches. When we want to create the threat model, the first step, we need to identify the assets which is handling by the application, data identification and classification. The first step we need to do. So the second step, system architecture overview, we need to understand. Data flow diagrams, workflow diagrams, clearly we need to understand. Then step 3, decompose the application. It includes the identifying external dependency, threat agent, C-bomb, cyber security bill of materials, entry points of the application to execute any vulnerabilities, abuse cases of the system to exploit any security issues. So these aspects also we need to decompose and we need to understand the architecture. Identify all possible threats based on the security standards. Security standards and practices we already saw. NIST, ARM, Microsoft, CVE. These are all the practices already we have in the open source standards. We can refer and we can create the threat modeling accordingly. Attack surfaces also we need to consider when we identify the threat. So based on the identified threats, we can categorize with this stride mapping. Once we identify the security threats, required security controls also we need to identify to mitigate the threats. So based on the possible threats and security controls, we need to create the risk assessment. So when we create the risk assessment in threat modeling, possible threats and security controls are prerequisite. Once we identify, we can start to create the risk assessment for the application or system. So at least these basic steps we need to follow when we execute the threat modeling. Okay, asset identification. This is the sample web application we already saw. Example, if we see the asset list in the third column, web login function, web login credentials, web login communication, user and role configurations, API configuration, JWT configuration. At least these are all the assets we need to secure from the cyber threats, right? So that we call it as asset here. And the descriptions also mentioned here. Example, the web login function means client login form, login validation, authentication methods. So all this aspect we need to see when we create the threat model. Also the severity of the asset, the confidentiality, integrity and availability aspect. What is the severity? Maybe high, high, low, I given it here. So the sample web application, I created the asset list. You can refer this asset list later also. Here you can see around 33 assets I have identified for a sample web application. This is very basic sample web application. The backend components also very basic components only I considered, and I created the asset list. Suppose assume that if we have more component and more complex design or complex architecture in the backend, the asset list we need to include accordingly. This is only reference model only. So whenever we create the asset list, all the detailed assets we need to identify to execute the threat model. Once we identify the asset, the next point, the personal or confidential data we need to identify and we need to categorize. Example, this is the basic web application, and assume that the application is handling by the personal data and the EPHI medical data. So based on that, the personal data we can identify the login credential, patient name, patient address, phone numbers, medical measurable or reading data, application backup and restoration files, application activity logs. At least these are all the data it is handling by the application, right? Personal data identification we need to do, and we need to see how criticality this data is, like medium, low, high. Priority also we can give if it is required. Then the third action, bill of materials we need to create, the software bill of materials or cyber security bill of materials. Example, assume that the application have AngularJS framework, Java, Tomcat, database, server-side programming framework. So all the third-party components and open source components we need to list out, and we need to check whether the component have any known vulnerabilities from the CVE or other portals. Suppose if it is any vulnerable is present, we need to consider that also one of the input in the whenever we create the cyber security bill of materials. Once we identify the basic input like asset, data types and software components, cyber security bill of materials, we can create the data flow diagrams. We can use to any of the architecture tools and we can create the data flow diagram. Example, this is the diagram from the thread dragon tool I used, and I created the data flow diagram for the sample web application. The interfaces also, interfaces and communication protocols also you can mention. Example, the interface ID 1, web application to web server, HTTPS communication, web server to DB. This is TCP communication. Just for a sample purpose I mentioned here. So like that, how many interfaces are there and what protocols are using in between the components or external endpoints. So that aspect we can see whenever we create the threat model. We need to gather this input also. Okay, user roles. Once we come to the user roles, here in the data flow diagram you can see two user groups are mentioned here. One is administrator, another one is user group. So two user groups are handling by the application. So I given the user group 1 and administrator user group 2. These two groups are open. And permissions aspect, what are all the permissions? Have the user privileged users, administrator privileged users. That input also we need to understand thoroughly. Suppose if we have any authorization management threats, we can identify. That is why clearly we need to understand the user groups also. Decompose the application architecture. Once we identify at least this input, we need to decompose the architecture and we need to understand the system architecture. Example, the external dependencies. Assume that these are all the dependencies we are using in the within the application or external applications. Example, the web server framework on the backend side, JSON parser, HTML parser, CSS parser, cryptographic libraries, Angular JS framework, TLS certificate, database, authentication server, web client browsers. So at least these are all the external dependencies we have in the application. We need to consider that. Then the threat entry points. Threat entry points nothing but these are all the gates for the attackers. They may try to exploit the vulnerability in the application. Maybe some threats will be in the web server side, web client side, HTTP APIs, TLS certificate, authentication mechanism, authorization mechanism, JWT token, server side logs, web server to web client communication, web server to database communication, database side web connection, web database connection or database communication, API gateway, encryption algorithms, cryptographic libraries. At least these are all the entry points we need to consider when we execute the threat model. Okay, once we get the technical inputs, the threat agent also we need to identify for the application. Example, what type of threat agent can exploit the vulnerability? He may be the real-time hackers or competitors. That is one category. Second category, the internal users itself. Maybe the low privileged users, high privileged users. Sometimes administrator level threats also we need to identify, right? Then the dump users, unawareness or basic students users, they may unintentionally exploits the vulnerabilities, right? So these aspects we need to consider all these threat agent aspects and we need to create the possible threats for the application. Threat agent also one of the input we need to consider when we create the threat model. Based on these inputs, now we can determine the threats and the security controls for the application. Here we are talking about the sample web application. Based on that, we can create the threads for the sample web application. So here I given the slide description also. If it is required, you can refer description. Maybe spoofing, tampering, reputation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privileges. So the basic descriptions I have given. So based on the description, we can understand the stride methodology and we can categorize the threads whenever we identify the threads in the application. Okay, this is the threat identification and categorization. So first one is the sample threat ID I given and the assets, which assets we identified the threat. Example, the web login function is one of the assets we already saw. So there spoofing and tampering related threats identified. Example, the threat description is an adversary can execute the unauthorized access if the application does not implement the login function for all the sensitive APIs. Suppose if we miss to implement the authentication tokens some of the APIs, it may give threats to exploit the unauthorized access related threats, right? So that is why we need to consider that as one threat. And attack surface, why the attack surface is happening? Missing authentication function for few of the APIs. That is the attack surface. Then the second asset, web login function, again same. This is tampering related attack. An adversary can execute the injection related attacks if the web client login form does not support the data validation at the client side. Meantime, the third threat also I given, data input validation at the server side. Client side and server side, both the aspects we need to do the input validation. That is why two types of threads you can see, one is client side, another one is server side. Also the attack surface missing client side input validation is the second threat attack surface here. So like that, around 40 threads I have identified for the application. So this is end-to-end threads list. So whenever you want to create the threat modeling, all these aspects you can consider and you can create the all possible threads so that it will be easy to achieve end-to-end security for the application or system. Okay, once we identify the threats, the next step we need to identify required security controls to mitigate the identified threats, right? Example, the security controls: authentication, authorization, session validation, session timeout. Around 35 security controls I have identified to mitigate the identified threats. So you can refer these security controls also. Based on these threats and security controls, we need to do the risk assessment that we will see in the next topic. Okay, the next one is like general threat modeling. Suppose if you want to learn about the threat model, Microsoft ARM have the practices. Also, if how we need to identify the assets, the NIST have to identify the asset. Suppose if you have guidelines to identify the asset, NIST have the guidelines. Data identification and classification also, NIST have the best practices. Data flow workflow diagrams, Threat Dragon, Microsoft Threat Model, these tools are available to create the data flow diagrams. Threat identification, OWASP top 10, SANS, CWE, NIST, CVA, there have multiple standards to identify the threats. Threat classification, mostly STRIDE we can use and we can categorize the threats. Security controls, again OWASP top 10, SANS, CWE, NIST 853. Based on these practices, we can create the security controls. Risk rating calculation, we can use the CVSS calculator and we can create the risk rating. Also the risk assessment analysis, once we identify the possible threats and security controls, we need to create the risk assessment also. I already covered one of the training session how to create the risk assessment. We can see the sample risk assessment now also. So these are all the reference at least you can do whenever you create the threat model and risk assessment of your application or system. Okay, once we identify all possible threats and security controls from the threat model, then we can start to create the risk assessment report. We already saw in training 5 how to create risk assessment. So the detailed risk assessment creation we already saw in one of the training and it is available in the training 5. Suppose if need more details about the risk assessment preparation, you can refer that video. Example, here you can see this is the threat description. An adversary can execute the unauthorized access if the application does not implement the login function for all the sensitive APIs. This is what we saw in the first thread. The pre-risk control based on the CVSS calculator. Suppose assume that if we are not implementing the required security controls, the CVSS risk rate is high, likelihood also high, and the risk level is unacceptable. So current security controls, the first and second security controls are relevant and we can implement that security controls. Further recommendation, implement a login function on the client side and server shall allow to login only authenticated users. Suppose if we implement these security controls, the post risk controls, there will not be any risk. All the threads we need to create, we need to update in the sheet and we need to create the pre-risk assessment and post-risk assessment, all these aspects. Whenever the residual risk is required, residual risk nothing but if we have any open threads, that threads should be comes under the residual risk. Also the impact analysis we need to do, and whenever we need to update the security requirements based on the security controls, we can update and we can finalize the security requirements. So this is what the threat model and risk assessments we need to conduct when we develop the application or product development in the industries. Okay friends, I have done my session today. I will update the report also for further reference. Suppose if you have any clarification, you can post your clarifications in the comment section. I will provide required inputs if it is required. Thank you for watching this training video. I will see you in next session. Bye.